Hey, if you got a Bible, open up with me to 2 Corinthians chapter 12. 2 Corinthians chapter 12. We'll read that text in just a minute. And this is our last week on this series called Christianity as God Intended. And we've pretty much spent a couple of months just talking through what it really means to be a follower of Jesus. And we've really tried to stand up against the idea of nominal Christianity, that people say, I'm a Christian, they check that box, but when you actually look at the way that they live, there's really not that much Christ following that's actually going on. And so we've tried to cover topics in ways that nominal Christians struggle, and we've tried to encourage them the whole time to follow Christ and bow your knee. And so today we want to look at that a lot of times that when we face pain and suffering, it can actually push people away from Jesus. And even people who say that they're Christians. But the goal is that we would draw close to Christ, even in the midst of pain. So, for example, recently I saw on social media, some of you guys saw it too, there's a really popular Christian artist named Forrest Frank. He's super popular, especially with a lot of Gen Z. And he fell on a skateboard at his house, and he broke his back. Raise your hand if you guys saw that on social media. So, yeah, everybody under like 40 definitely saw it. And while he was laying in bed with a broken back, he wrote like an insanely popular song called Lemonade. I'm not going to sing it for you, but it's a really great song. That God takes lemons and he can make lemonade. But then he had this like amazing testimony that he went to the doctor and God supernaturally, miraculously healed his back and he was better. And that's a beautiful thing. And let me say it very clearly. God still heals people like that. God has that kind of power, and God can still work like that in our lives, and he does, at his will, at his sovereignty, at his providence, in the way that he sees fit. But when I saw that, what I thought of is well, what happens when you're a Christian and God doesn't heal your back? What happens when you say, I'm a follower of Jesus, and you come to God and you say, God, would you work this out? And it doesn't work out in the way that you want it to work out. Or what happens if you're here today and you say, I'm a Christian, and you have experiences that you've cried out to God and you feel like God was silent in the midst of that cry? Or what if you've had seasons that it was just so dark, that life was just so difficult, that you sort of felt numb? Like it's hard for you to know what day of the week it is, what month it is, what season it is, because your mind and your heart is just distracted because you're facing something that's just very difficult and hard. And maybe in that really dark moment, if you could just be like, not fake. The positive way of saying it is say transparent. But the reality is sometimes as Christians, we're fake. And we're not willing to actually say the ways that we struggle. But if you could just be transparent and say the way that you struggle, you could just say out loud, God, why does this have to be so hard? If you're here and you've had experiences like that, the good news for you is you're not alone. So did the Apostle Paul, and he actually wrote this section of Scripture in light of experiencing something that was painful and hard. Because here's the point. The point is, when we experience pain and suffering and hardship, if we say we're followers of Jesus, those experiences should not push us away from Christ, but it should push us deeper into his grace. That's the point that he's going to make. So let me read it, and then we're going to begin to unpack this verse by verse. So go down to verse 7. Here's what it says. So to keep me from becoming conceited because of the surpassing greatness of the revelations, a thorn was given to me in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to harass me, to keep me from becoming conceited. And 3 times I pleaded with the Lord about this, that it should leave me. But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore I will boast all the more gladly of my weakness, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. For the sake of Christ, then I am content with weakness, insults, hardships, persecution, and calamities. For when I am weak, then I am strong. So let me start off by just asking sort of a philosophical question. Not that everybody's asking this question, but I think some people may have asked this in some way, shape, or form. But a really good question would be, why does suffering exist? Like, why do we have to experience people we love die, or be chronically ill, or get cancer? or marriages go through hardship or even divorce, money problems, universal poverty all around us, racial issues. I mean, why do we have to experience a world that has so many things that can negatively affect you? And the short answer to that is one word. It's sin. That pain and suffering exist because sin is inside of this world that we live. And sin has messed up everything. The Bible actually teaches that sin has affected our relationships with one another, that sin has affected our work, it's affected the physical earth itself, it's affected everything. That even as Romans chapter 8 says that the world itself is groaning for the return of Christ so that it can be returned to the way that it was supposed to be all the way back in the Garden of Eden. And the reason this is an important question, because if you've really been in a deep hole at some point in your life, you've probably wrestled with this idea that if God is good and God is all-powerful, why doesn't he stop evil from happening? It's a good question. It's an old question, all the way back to the Greeks. A guy named Epicurus used to ask that question. And the answer to that is that sin exists because you and I have the capacity to make decisions. And the only way to eliminate sin and pain and suffering is to create a world in which you and I are robots and we just blindly follow God. And so as long as you and I have the capacity or a will to choose good or to choose evil, there will be a world filled with people, because of the people's sinful nature, to choose evil. And the only way that people don't choose evil is if they get a new nature, if they trust Jesus and they follow Christ. So in my understanding, the world is broken because of sin, and that is not God's fault. God created everything to be good. You and I are sort of like Adam and Eve. We're not sort of. They're representatives of us. They're types of us. And so because of that, we would have failed the same way that they did. And so because of that, sin's the problem. And Paul kind of alludes to that here in this section. He says, I'm experiencing something painful in order that I might not become conceited. I might not become arrogant. And he talks about he's having these revelations. Now, in verses 1 through 6, he's saying that he has these supernatural visions, these dreams and direct, God is audibly speaking to him and showing him things to do. And in light of that kind of connection to God, God is saying, I don't want you to become prideful of that. I don't want you to have this attitude that you think you're better than everybody because of this connection that you have with me. I want you to stay humble. So it appears that Paul must have struggled with his pride. And don't misunderstand the text. The text is not teaching explicitly that every time you experience something difficult or hard in this world, it's always the byproduct of your sin. Like God is punishing you or God is disciplining you. There are times it's like that. But most of the time, sometimes we just experience pain. The Bible says that it rains on the just and the unjust. You have the story of Job, who didn't necessarily do anything. He was sinful, but he didn't necessarily do anything sinful or wicked to experience the pain that he experienced. Jesus was sinless, and he experienced a lot of pain in his life. But the point that he's trying to make is sometimes God does discipline us. He does things in our lives to keep us humble. And the way that it seems to be struggling for Paul is he says it's like a thorn in the flesh. A thorn, literally that word means, it means like a stake, like some type of stick or rod that would impale somebody, that would poke you, that would pierce you. And that piercing would create pain. And he says that I have this thorn, I have this thing that is inflicting me with pain like a sharp object, and it's hurting my flesh. Now, the flesh could be a reference to his sinful nature, or it could be a reference to his physical body, and maybe a little bit of both. But it seems to be that whatever this thorn is in his life that's piercing him, at least according to Galatians 4, has something to do with his physical health. And if you're a nerd, especially theologically, you could get into deep rabbit holes of what the thorn was. And there's all kinds of people with speculations and theories. Here's some of them. Some people say it could have been his struggle with some sort of mental health issue, that he battled with anxiety, he battled with depression, or just being easily discouraged. And it was hard for him to control that. And he had these huge times where he was just down and out because of that mental health stuff. Some people said it could be his bad eyesight. That's kind of the way that I lean. Some people say it could have been something about his appearance. This is kind of a funny one. That people mocked him when they saw him because he just looked weird. So some people think he could have been really, really short, no shade at short people, or he could have been bald, no shade at bald people. But some people actually theorize and say that when he walked into a room, people automatically would say, this guy's like a loser. We're not going to interact with him because of those physical features that he had. Some people think it could have been an internal tendency of struggling with a particular sin, something in his actual sinful nature. So maybe that could have been his pride. Maybe that could have been not controlling his anger or lustful thoughts or something along those lines. We don't know. Some people said he was single. And it could have been that this thorn in his side, that he was struggling, that he wanted to be married, and God wasn't allowing him. Now, there's a little bit of a stretch there, and we don't really know for sure. And it's my understanding that this is vague on purpose. Because when you and I talk about pain and suffering, we're prone to compare our pain and suffering. And when we compare our pain and sufferings, where our temptation is to sometimes discredit advice that we would receive because people don't know what it's like to be in our shoes. Maybe you don't do that, but I'm telling you a lot of people do that. So, for example, using the text, if he said, I'm struggling with my mental health, but God's grace is sufficient when I'm struggling with my mental health, then all the people that would read that and maybe are struggling with a loved one who's battling cancer, you would say, well, he's actually talking to mental health. He's not talking to somebody struggling with cancer, and you would just kind of discredit that. But the way that the text reads is it's ambiguous. We might think it's with his physical body, but it's sort of open-ended. So I think the implications of the text is whatever you have in your life that is piercing you and hurting you, then what he says applies to it. And the other thing I want you to notice is he says that God is allowing it in God's sovereignty, in God's control of the universe, but Satan is the one who's gladly inflicting him with it. So what Paul is saying is, God's the one that's in control, but sometimes in God's control, he allows the enemy to bring turmoil and pain inside of our lives. Now that might be tough for you to understand, but that is exactly how it works in the world in which we live. And the best example of that is there's a whole book called the Book of Job. And the first 3 chapters paint this picture of God having a conversation with Satan, and Satan saying, the only reason Job follows you is because his life is so easy and comfortable. If you will let me rob him of that, he will curse you, God. And God allows him to experience some of the greatest pain that any human being can ever experience. And so I just want to say out loud today that God is in the midst of our pain, and he has a purpose for our pain. But I do not want us to forget that there is an enemy that wants to destroy your life and destroy my life. Ephesians 6 says that we do not wage war against flesh and blood, but that Satan wants to push us away from the God of the universe. And if you've ever read the Gospels, you know that demonic forces and Satan has a lot of power. So he has the power to cause physical illness, disabilities like blindness, being mute, paralysis. He's got the power to torment people mentally and emotionally. He has the power to create bondage or oppression. He has the power to create destructive behavior and self-harm and many other schemes. And don't misunderstand what I'm saying. I'm not saying that every sickness is the byproduct of Satan. And I'm not saying every mental health thing is a demon. I am saying that we sometimes in the church, we discredit the reality that there's an enemy that never sleeps. And all he wants to do is to steal and to kill and destroy from your life. And what Paul is saying is that God has a purpose in the pain, but what Satan is doing is he's trying to use the pain to do the opposite. That Satan wants to use the pain to push Paul away from Christ, to push Paul away from God's grace and God's power. That he just wants to harass us. So I guess I just wanted to say it out loud. I wanted to bring it into the light, the schemes of our enemy. And if you've ever thought about this, it's an amazing thought. Sort of this paradox of how Satan is trying to do something for evil, but God in his providence are using it for good. So Satan puts something in the life of a Christian to actually push them away from God, to ruin their life, to lead them to sin. But God, if we would submit to the Lord and do it God's way, the same pain that he's inflicting in our life can actually mature us. It can grow us. We can develop character and perseverance and be stronger after it. So you have this thing as a Christian where he's trying to wreck us through pain, and God can redeem that for good in our lives. And the greatest example of that is the cross of Christ. That when you read those narratives in all 4 Gospels of how Jesus is going to the cross if you could have been alive in that moment and watched that trail, like those events happen in those order, you would believe that Satan won. I mean, Jesus is betrayed by one of his own. He's falsely arrested like he's this horrible scumbag of a leader. They have a false trial. They begin to mock him. They begin to ridicule him. They flog him. They have a chance to set him free, and they don't. And ultimately, he's nailed to a cross. And he dies on a cross between two thieves. And if you could be there all those years ago, it would feel as if the schemes of Satan were accomplished. And that he's wrecked God's redemptive plan. And that's what I'm saying. There's a dynamic where this just sort of blows your mind when you think about it. Because even though Satan is trying to destroy, God's redeeming it for his kingdom purposes. So even though it looked like Satan won, he didn't. God was in control the whole time. And Jesus rises from the dead, conquering sin and death forever. And so it's this beautiful picture. The next question is, why can't we escape the pain? Because in the text, Paul says, 3 times I asked God to remove this thorn. That has to be, if you are struggling, that has to be one of the most beautiful verses in the Bible for you. Because you pray and you pray and you pray and you pray, and it doesn't get answered in the way that you want the prayer to be answered. That Paul knows what that feels like. And what he says is that God did not remove the thorn because God had a plan for the thorn. And here's the plan. The purpose of the thorn is to show Paul that he is weak. And when Paul knows that he is weak, he has one choice after that: depend on the Lord. So as long as he has this painful thing in his flesh, he is always going to be aware that he needs the Lord's guidance and direction. I heard a pastor say one time that you don't know the Lord is all that you need until he's all that you have. And what he says is that it was only in my weakness with this thorn, and I want to be clear, he hates the thorn. If Paul could decide his life and be in control, there would be no thorn. But what Paul says is, it's only because of that thorn that he realizes that God's grace is sufficient for him, and that God's power is made perfect in his weakness. That God is not saying that our weaknesses and our shortcomings are a mistake. What he's saying is that our weaknesses are an opportunity for God to display his power and his strength. So here's what this means. You and I don't need to hide our weakness. We don't need to pretend like we've got it all together. We need to lean on a God who does have it all together and who does not have weaknesses. Now watch now. One of the commentaries I read, this is just sort of like an interesting thing, that this section of this chapter, this verse that says that in my weakness he's made strong, that's something called a chiasm. I'm sure there's some like grammar people in here that totally know what that is, some literature people, but I didn't until I looked it up. And basically the idea of a chiasm is especially in the New Testament and the Old Testament, is it kind of takes a verse and it puts something right at the center of that verse. And it's structured in a way that if you could diagram it, whatever's right in the middle is the main point. And what's at the middle of this verse is God's power and God's grace. So everything about the struggle, everything about the thorn, all of the battle that Paul is struggling with is to highlight God's power and God's grace. And so what that means for you and me is whatever is on your plate, like whatever it is that you would say that's like a thorn, it pierces me. I don't like it, and if I had my way, it would not be like that. The Bible says that the purpose of that is to highlight God's power in your life and to highlight God's grace in your life. That it doesn't wreck you, it doesn't destroy you. It actually, the pain, the thorn, gives you a clear picture of the God who loves you and has saved you. So maybe think about it like this. Have you guys ever noticed how we spend so much of our time and energy trying to mask our weaknesses. And maybe you're not like that. Maybe you're transparent and you have no problem just being you in all of your rawness. But my experience is most of us spend lots of mental and physical energy exaggerating our strengths or hiding our flaws. And so if we're insecure, the worst thing that could happen is people know that we are insecure. Or if we're bad at something, the worst thing that could happen is everybody knows we're bad at that. And I'm just asking the question this morning, why do we do that? Why are we so worried that if people see I stink at something, that they're not going to want to hang out with us anymore, be our friends? What's wrong with us? So what we do is we're tired and we're weary. We're like a little hamster in a ball that's spinning, and we're just running for our image. And we're not willing to actually reveal where our weaknesses are. So imagine if we started a trend. This is probably never going to happen, but just hear me out, okay? Imagine if we started a trend on social media and in Palatka, that when we get around people, we start with sharing things that we're bad at, relationally. Hi, my name's Daniel, and I am a people pleaser. I'm a people pleaser to the point that I will hold a grudge against you for months instead of just telling you that you've upset me. I will ball it up to the point that I kind of hate you. It's toxic, it's bad, it's unhealthy, it ruins friendships over the years of my life, and I hate that about me. And I've got a deviated septum, one nostril works sometimes it doesn't. You know what I'm saying? What if we just approached, you maybe don't have to share your physical weaknesses, but the point is, what if we just approach relationships like that? But a lot of us would think, that's literally the most insane thing I've ever heard. I would never do that. Most of us do the opposite, where we just want to share how great we are and how awesome we are and who we know and who we, right? It's just all about boasting about our strengths and not in our weaknesses. So what does this mean for your life and my life? Well, I think it means that our weaknesses are a gift from God. And pain and suffering has a way of revealing things about us that are not where they need to be. So if the pain and suffering reveals pockets in our character or things in our life that are not healthy and right and good, that are weak, then we need to lean into our weaknesses, not be in denial of them. And I know sports analogies never land with half the people in the church, but this is the best way that I could think about it. So you guys know I'm a big basketball fan. And regardless of your opinion, I would say LeBron James is arguably the second best player in the history of the NBA. And when LeBron James first came into the league, he was one of the, if not the most athletic dude in the league. He was 6'8", well over 200 pounds, and could jump higher than anybody and was faster than anybody. And he did that coming out of high school. But in his basketball game, he had all sorts of weaknesses in his game. So he wasn't the best passer, he wasn't the best free throw shooter, he wasn't the best outside jump shot shooter, and his defense was good, but it wasn't great. And here's what LeBron James did over his entire career, and he's still balling today. What he did was he would take one of the things that he was weak, and in 2 or 3 off seasons, he would fix it. So he might not be the best passer in the league, but after 2 or 3 seasons, in the off seasons, he would develop his passing game where he would go from being one of the mediocre or lower end guys in the league to being top 5. And now, as a veteran who's really old, he's like the complete package of an NBA player. He can literally do it all. And he's top 5 in virtually every single thing a basketball player needs to do. And so he spent his entire career basically developing and growing his weaknesses. Now, I share that with you to say that that is great for sports, and maybe that's great for business. But that is not the way the Christian life should look. The Christian life should not necessarily look that you have a weakness and you spend your life to make sure that nobody knows that weakness and you become strong in another area. To me, the way that this text reads is that when you have a weakness, here's what you do. You just own it. You say, this is an area in my life that I am not strong. And then you come to God and you say, God, the good news is you're for me. And even though I'm weak at this, you can help me in my weakness. I'm not saying, don't misunderstand me, I'm not saying that we don't need to grow in leadership. I'm not saying that Christians don't need to develop. I'm not saying that. I am saying some of you in this room will spend the rest of your life, and the things that you struggled with 10 years ago, you're going to struggle 10 years from now. And you could look at that two ways. You could look at that as you live a life of defeat, or you could let that thing that you struggle with push you deeper in the arms of a God that loves you. And if we're not careful, these thorns that are revealing our inadequacies are not going to accomplish the mission that God wants to accomplish for it. So I just want to ask you today, do you need to change your mind on the pain and suffering which you've experienced? Do you find that when life gets difficult, it draws you closer to Jesus? Or do you find it actually is harder to spend time with Jesus in the midst of pain? How do you see your weaknesses? When you realize, because this is what weaknesses feel like, especially in pain, you think, I don't know how to fix this. I don't know how to resolve this. I don't know how to think about this. And sometimes you think, I just need to escape to get away from it. Like that moment of just struggle for a Christian should lead us to the one who's died for us. And we come to him and we say, God, I don't have answers for any of this, but I'm so grateful you're with me in a time such as this. And we want to walk with him, we want to follow him, and we want to be completely surrendered and dependent on him. That is what Paul is saying in 2 Corinthians 12. That in our weakness he is made strong. So what's all this mean? So let me share with you some ways that this text has come out in my life over the last month. So where's James? James, you can come back up. We're just going to play some music. We're going to spend some time in the service closing out. We're not going to sing a song at the end, but we're just going to spend some